Hey guys, so before I get into this video, I wanted to pop in here real quick and just thank everyone who has subscribed to my channel so far. We are almost at 500 subscribers, which is so crazy to me. So I am hoping to do some sort of Q&A on here just when I hit that 500 subscriber mark to get a little bit more personal, a bit more outside of just photography. So if you have any questions, please leave them down below. I will be asking for them on Instagram as well. So feel free to hop over to my Instagram and submit any questions there. Once again, I really appreciate everyone who has subscribed so far. It is surreal to me that we are almost at 500 and it's been kind of a crazy journey already. So just wanted to pop in, say that, leave your questions down below as well as any other comments that you have just about the video in general. But without further ado, let's get into this video. What's up everyone and welcome back to my channel. So today I wanted to film a video all on shooting manual and how I shoot manual when it comes to photography. And this involves the three components of the exposure triangle: ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. And so I wanted to cover those as well. Now you can easily look up these three components on Google and find out probably in more detail about each of them, more than I can provide. However, I wanted to actually film this video because when I was starting out shooting manual, I had a really hard time understanding how the three worked together and connecting all of the dots to figure out how to properly take a photo using all manual settings. So hopefully this video today helps with some of that if you are new to manual photography, or I could provide any piece of new information for someone even if you have been shooting manual for quite a long time. So starting off with the basic information, when it comes to a typical camera, it works in a very basic way like this. So I have my Aperture to show you guys, but basically at this base of the camera there is something that is going to save the data in terms of the image itself. In the case of a digital camera, you're gonna have a sensor here that is going to be able to capture the visual data of whatever you're taking a photo of, but in the case of film photography, you're gonna have the film stock that's going to save that image. You're also gonna have a lens that is going to let the light in, but in the case of an SLR camera, you also have a mirror protecting whatever sensor or film stock from actually having the light go through. When you click the shutter button, there is a series of mechanisms that will basically allow whatever mirror or shutter to pop up that will let the light come through and be saved onto the sensor or the film stock. So that's the super basic terminology in terms of understanding the three components of the exposure triangle that you're going to need for this video. So the first thing in the exposure triangle that I'm going to talk about is the ISO. ISO is basically the sensitivity to light of either the digital sensor or the film stock. And the higher the ISO, the more sensitive it is to light, and the lower the ISO, the less sensitive it is to light. So when I say more sensitive, that just simply means it takes less light to come through for the sensor or the film stock to pick up that information. So when you're shooting in low light situations, you'll want a higher ISO so that even though there is less light coming through, it can still pick up the visual image. When you're shooting in super bright situations, having a super high sensitivity will only cause the image to be overexposed because all of that light is being picked up by the sensor or the film. So you would want a lower ISO to properly expose that image. Now the one thing to note about ISO is that the higher the ISO, the more grainy the image. So if you are someone who does not like the grainy look or noise in your photos, just keep that in mind when shooting in low light situations and trying to determine the proper ISO for that. So next is your aperture. Aperture is going to be on the lens itself. The lens, if you actually look very closely and you adjust the aperture, there are these blades that are kind of shaped in a circular pattern that get smaller or get bigger depending on how you adjust the aperture. So a wide open aperture will let in more light through the lens. However, a more closed aperture will let in less light through the lens. And that's where you're going to get your different levels of exposure. Now, there are a few things to keep note of when it comes to aperture. In terms of number, the wider open the aperture, the lower the number you're looking at for the f-stop value. However, if I turn my aperture up to like f16, then that actually coordinates with a more closed lens or less light being let through. Another thing to note with aperture is it's what's going to affect your depth of field. So when I want that shallow depth of field, kind of like this, with the blurry background and super sharp subject in focus, that's going to be a wider open aperture. But if I were to want everything in focus, I would actually want a higher f-stop number to achieve that look. So typically landscape photographers will shoot at f12 or higher, depending on the situation. That's what's going to give you the more in-focused image versus the shallower depth of field image. So the last piece of the exposure triangle is the shutter speed. The shutter speed is basically how long your sensor or your film stock is going to have to basically have light being let in. So a longer shutter speed would let more light in, and a quicker shutter speed would let less light in. In terms of how it affects the photo, a longer shutter speed would actually allow for motion blur because you're capturing data about the image the entire time the shutter is open. So if I have a shutter speed of 1 second and within the 1 second I wave like this, my sensor is going to be capturing the entirety of that wave. However, if I have a very quick shutter speed of a tiny fraction of a second, it's going to be able to stop that motion and get a nice clear image mid-wave instead of capturing the entire wave. So in terms of how I actually determine my settings when I am out shooting, there's a specific order to it, as well as me taking in information of what I want to capture, how I want to capture something, and determining my settings based on that information. Typically I start with the ISO. This is actually something that's become habit because of shooting film. When I shoot film, I will choose a film to shoot for the day depending on the situation, and that will automatically determine my ISO. When it comes to digital, you have a lot more flexibility. Not only can you change the ISO from photo to photo, but there's so many more increments of ISO that you can adjust versus the limited choices you have when shooting film. So a good general rule of thumb for me is to start with ISO of 400. This is usually the perfect ISO for cloudy days or golden hour. However, if I'm shooting at a brighter point of the day or in a very brightly lit situation, I will turn the ISO down to 100 to 200. On the opposite end of that, if I'm shooting in blue hour or simply just at night, I will turn the ISO up to have my sensor be more sensitive to the low light situation that I'm giving it. So next is my aperture. So when it comes to aperture, typically if I'm shooting portraits, I will open up the lens to around f2 to 2.8. This is also great for lower light situations when I want to let more light in. I want to open up the lens to as wide as it can get. Another thing is that if I'm shooting in brightly lit situations or landscapes, I will typically start at like f8 and go higher depending on how the photo turns out and how I want to change it. So the last is shutter speed. So with shutter speed, a lot of times I will want the quickest possible shutter speed to make sure that my photo is clear. There's no camera shake and blurriness to it, especially if my camera does not have in-body image stabilization, because one little shake of the camera will cause motion blur to occur if my shutter speed is not fast enough. And this is actually where I want to talk about long exposures, because when it comes to long exposures, like capturing the smooth flow of a waterfall, that's where your shutter speed is going to come into play. The longer the shutter speed, the more of that motion that you're capturing. If you are taking a photo of a car moving at night, the longer you keep the shutter open for, you're gonna get that streak of light from the headlights of the car. When it comes to slowing down your shutter speed or leaving your shutter open for longer, you're also introducing more light onto the sensor as long as you're keeping that shutter open, which will cause the photo to be highly overexposed. And by overexposing your photo via the shutter speed, unless you want a bright white photo, you're gonna want to underexpose in the ISO and aperture. And that means turning the ISO down so the sensor is less sensitive to light, as well as closing the lens more and turning your f-stop up. So by underexposing these two settings and having the shutter speed overexposed, you can get a nicely exposed photo that's not too bright or too dark. On the opposite end of things, oftentimes when I'm shooting in low light and I don't want camera shake, I need to keep my shutter speed pretty quick. by keeping the shutter speed quick, I'm not letting a lot of light come in. So my photo is going to be underexposed. But to make up for this, I need to crank my aperture wide open, so a lower aperture f-stop number, as well as making my sensor more sensitive to light by cranking the ISO level up. So by underexposing on the shutter speed setting, I need to overexpose on my aperture and ISO in order to make a nicely exposed photo. And this is really where all these three settings become a triangle and not just three separate settings. Because as I under or overexpose in one setting, I have to even it out and balance it out in other settings in order to get a nicely exposed photo. Another thing for me when it comes to shooting in manual mode is oftentimes I actually find myself adjusting the ISO in relation to the other two settings if I'm shooting in unique situations. For example, if I'm shooting a long exposure waterfall picture and I need a longer shutter speed, but at the same time I don't want a shallow depth of field, or I want the entire picture in focus, I need to adjust the aperture for that, and then I adjust the ISO to make sure that the photo is properly exposed. Another example is in low light situations where I may already know I want a super quick shutter speed, but then I want a wide open aperture, and then I'll adjust the ISO where it could be the minimum without being underexposed. However, on a normal basis, I actually shoot in aperture priority mode. That means I set the ISO and I set my aperture, and especially when I'm shooting on the X Pro 2, the aperture ring is right here on the lens, and I usually shoot decently wide open simply so that I have a quicker shutter speed so that there's no camera shake or motion blur when I want a nice sharp photo. So it really comes down to practicing and figuring out what you like and how different settings affect the photo for you. For me, shooting in aperture priority mode was a good step into fully manual photography, and again, I typically find myself shooting in aperture priority mode simply because it is quicker and it's more efficient. You'll find ways to make it efficient as well as things that you want. And like I said, if you adjust one setting in one way in terms of exposure levels, you have to even it out with other settings in another way to make sure that your photo still gets nicely exposed. So it is a little bit complicated, but again, practice helps a ton. You won't know how different settings really correlate to each other until you go out and test it on your own camera. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I hope everyone picked up a tip or two, especially if you are a beginner to manual photography. And if you have any questions, be sure to leave it down below. A lot of my subscribers are people who are more well seasoned as photographers. So if you guys have any tips that I missed or any corrections that need to be made on my video, please leave those down below as well. I appreciate all the comments that I get on my videos. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you enjoyed the content in this video as well as other Fujifilm, Olympus, and film photography content, be sure to subscribe to my channel because that is primarily what I talk about here. We are almost to 500 subscribers, which is crazy to me. So I really appreciate each and every one of you, and I will see you all in my next video.